Hi, good afternoon, everybody. We have about 5 minutes until the webinar will begin. So everybody is unmuted and look forward to hearing from our speakers. We'll start in about 5 minutes. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sherill Baldwin, and I'm with the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. I'm going to give everybody another minute or two. We had 167 registrations for this afternoon. I want to make sure that we have everybody that wants to be here is signed on successfully. So I'm just going to give it another minute before we begin. Thank you. Hi, welcome. My name is Sherill Baldwin. I'm with the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, and I'm your host and moderator today for the first of 5 webinars for the Connecticut Compost webinar series. Today you are here to learn about different scales of composting, sort of the overview and the introduction, if you will, from municipalities to farms. We have 3 speakers with us today, and I'm very excited to learn a lot from all of them. Everybody is on mute. If you are unaware, you are definitely on mute. And we encourage you to use the chat function to ask questions. So before we begin, I just want to say whether you are joining us today because you are trying to reduce waste or recover food and keep it out of the incinerator, or perhaps you're trying to increase the soil quality of your farm or community garden, composting plays a role in helping Connecticut become more green or more sustainable, as well as reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm pleased that the department is part of increasing our compost literacy in Connecticut. Just so you know, we do have 4 other webinars coming up. If you have not registered for them, you need to register for each one individually. You can find this information on the Connecticut NOFA webpage. That is ctnofa.org or ctnofa.org. I hope you're able to join us for all of them. We have a lot to learn. In terms of today's event, as well as the other 4 webinars, this was going to be, of course, an in-person conference in March, which was postponed, and we are doing it now as a webinar series free to everyone that wants to join us. And you can see the huge range of sponsors and partners, and a call out to all the planning partners that have been working for almost a year, if not just a year, to try to put together a great program that will help municipalities and farms look at adding food scraps to their existing composting operations. So today's program, as I mentioned, everybody is muted. And if you have questions, I encourage you to type your questions into the comment box. If you're new to the Zoom platform, what you would do is you would take your mouse and you would scroll it over your screen. And usually what happens is you find a bar at the bottom, and that includes a button for chat. Sometimes people might find the bar on the side or on the top. But in any case, if you move your mouse, you should be able to find the chat function. All webinars are going to be recorded, and they will be posted on 2 different web pages. Connecticut Deep has an archived Municipal Recycling Coordinator e-news and webinars webpage as part of their professional development. And I'm not sure the specifics, but CT NOFA will be posting the recordings on their webpage as well. A disclaimer, DEEP is hosting the Connecticut Compost webinar series in part as professional development for municipal recycling leaders. Presentations do not constitute DEEP policy. Mention of trade names or commercial products do not constitute endorsement or recommendation of use. Links to non-DEEP websites do not imply any official DEEP endorsement of or responsibility for the opinions, ideas, data, or products presented at those locations or guarantee the validity of the information provided. Links to non-DEEP servers are provided solely as a pointer for information that might be useful for DEEP staff and the public. And so without further ado, I'm very excited that so many are joining us today to hear first from Robert Isner, who is the Director of Waste Engineering in the Enforcement Division, and then James McSweeney, who's a consultant, educator, and author with Compost Technical Services, and then Coryanne Mansell from Center for EcoTechnology, where she is the Strategic Services Representative. Each presenter will speak, and then we will keep questions to the very end of all three speakers. Chelsea, would you unmute? It looks like Robert, you are already unmuted and ready to go. I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And if you could bring your presentation up, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, Sherill, I will be there in 1 minute. Okay, Sherill, thank you so much for that introduction, and Chelsea Hahn of the DEEP staff, thanks for your assistance today, and James and Corey, thanks very much for your assistance to help pull off the first of this series and to Connecticut NOFA for all of your efforts to work with us to change the venue into the webinar series. And with that said, I'll move forward. I am Robert Isner, the Director for the Waste Engineering and Enforcement Division at DEEP, and it really is a pleasure to be here virtually with everyone and to help tackle the issue that Sherill so eloquently overviewed.
Robert, I'm going to interrupt you. Is it possible to go into slideshow? You're currently just at, yeah.
Ah, yes.
Excellent.
I forgot the instructions you gave me yesterday, Sherill.
That's even better. Thank you so much, Robert.
Okay. Obviously, the introductory slide, and just a note that this is actually a photo from the town of Mansfield's pilot program. And they were one of the municipalities that sort of took advantage early on to start diverting organics to their compost program. So it's great to have some leaders, and we'll all learn as we go. One of the things that I think we all recognize, and that's why we're here, is that food waste is generated at every stage of the supply chain. And when food is wasted, we're also wasting all of the fresh water and the chemicals and the energy and land used to produce the food. So there's tremendous opportunities to reduce that food wasted, and that's what this whole seminar series is about. Many of you may be familiar with this. It comes from the state's Comprehensive Materials Management Strategy, our Solid Waste Management Plan, and it's a pretty typical breakdown of what's in the municipal solid waste stream. And if you sort of look at what would be about on a 5 o'clock to 9 o'clock section of a clock, that's really the bulk of material that's in the Connecticut waste stream that is just perfect for diversion for composting. And when you add up all those numbers, we're talking about almost 1 million tons a year of readily compostable organics. It's about 40% of the entire MSW waste stream. So when we look at some of the current issues that we have in the state with trying to reduce the solid waste that we need to manage and what are the opportunities, then composting provides a real opportunity for us here in Connecticut. So of that 1 million tons, about 500,000 tons is food waste, about 50,000 tons is yard waste, another 100,000 tons of leaves and grass, and about 250 tons of compostable paper. Things like paper plates and napkins and paper towels that are compatible for introduction with composting. In Connecticut, we have for large-scale generators a mandatory organics diversion law. So some of you may be familiar with this. The law was actually passed in 2011 and became effective in 2014 and targeted the really large generators of organics. So some entities are in. The law initially started off with a threshold of 104 tons per year or 2 tons per week, but that threshold changed to 1 ton a week of source separated organics. That threshold changed as of January of this year. And the keys to that law are if you're a large scale generator with that volume and you're located within 20 miles of a facility permitted to take organics, then you're required to divert that material to a facility that's permitted to receive it. So we're looking at taking some of the large scale organics and putting those into a mandatory diversion program. Some of the large scale facilities that we currently have permit in the state are on the department's website. That's where this table came from. The bolded facilities are those facilities that are actually permitted and built out. So we care. In Ellington is a large composting facility. New Milford Farms in New Milford is another large composting facility. Quantum Biopower is an anaerobic digester. In Southington, in New England Compost, in Danbury. These are the large scale facilities. The other 3 facilities listed are anaerobic digesters that are permitted but not yet built out. Food has its own management hierarchy, just like we have a solid waste management hierarchy. So for food, we want to source reduce, and then feed hungry people and feed animals, and look for industrial uses in composting, which is the focus of the series. And last, and we really want to avoid this, is landfilling. So there are a variety of tools that we have available to help divert composting. When you look at the bullet list on the left hand of the slide, there's a lot of composting options that we'll talk a little bit further about now. One of the things that's important to recognize is there are food recovery programs that help take food that is very usable and bring it to pantries and shelters where it can be reused for its higher use, and that's to feed hungry people. So if you're interested in exploring these types of programs, the slides will be available, and these are hyperlinks to some of the existing food recovery programs in the state. One of the things that Sherill and some of the deep staff did early on was work with the Harvard Law Policy Clinic to provide some information to take some of the scary aspects of considering a food donation, to make sure that folks that are going to do this recognize that there really is limited liability and there can be tax benefits. So there's a variety of fact sheets that we've pulled together that can help make it a little easier for the decision to take organics, divert them from the waste stream, get them to folks that can actually use that food in a very beneficial way. There's other things that we can do, and when we take a more grassroots approach, the notion of being able to home compost has a lot of opportunity, and we've seen municipalities that have taken this on individually. There are regional organizations, solid waste organizations, that have put together programs to help provide home composting bins and the technical assistance to get people to compost at the point of generation in their own backyard, and it's something that's very easy and effective to do. And then another option is worm composting, which again has a lot of success behind it. There are a variety of different on-site composting programs that can be undertaken. And one of the things we've looked at from the deep perspective is for small scale on-site composting programs. So small scale would be less than 5,000 cubic yards a year. It's not going to require a solid waste permit. So that will make it a little easier for some of these more localized small scale operations to get started. And this would be something that could be taken advantage by a variety of different institutions or small bed and breakfast, those types of operations. DEP actually had a very successful on-site composting program at our headquarters building in Hartford to show that this really can be done both in suburban and urban areas. Our commercial composting bin ran through its useful life, and then we actually switched to collection and moving our organics generated from the Hartford building to the anaerobic digester in Southington. As mentioned before, vermicompost is a great option, and I haven't done this, but if you've ever seen a classroom of kids that are being educated on vermicomposting, the feedback that I've heard is it's quite a thrill to see the children's reaction, and we all know if we can educate our youth on some new options, there can be a lot of value to that. We are seeing an uptick in community composting as there's more momentum building behind many different composting operations. So you can have groups that come together to form something on a more regional, local basis. There's a couple of examples that are shown here. Making Green was the first food recycling program of its kind in the state, and it was created in conjunction with the Roots Mobile Market in Britain's downtown farmers market. So there's a program where you pay into it, and then when you return your food scraps, you get credit that you can use at the downtown businesses. So a pretty neat little opportunity. Because we have a lot of municipal folks, we do look to encourage and promote collection of food scraps at the municipal transfer stations throughout the state. Many of our municipal transfer stations are operating under the general permit that was issued by the department, and that does include the ability to collect food scraps for transfer to other commercial operations, but there are also other opportunities that we can work, the department can work with individual municipalities that want to do some additional composting at their transfer station or public works facility if they have the space available. One of the things that we're always providing is technical and compliance assistance for municipalities and small businesses that want to explore the different options and opportunities for composting. These days, it's easier to email us as we all continue to work under the remote telework arrangements. So Karen Harder is one of our technical experts on organics and composting. So Karen's information is provided on this slide, but you could certainly reach out to me or Sherill after the webinar for additional information. Sort of getting into the regulatory requirements for composting, food and organics are a subset of solid waste. So the management of this material does require most often a permit from the department. So if it's a large scale operation, some large scale composting and anaerobic digesters, that's going to fall into something that would require an individual permit from the department. But as I mentioned earlier, we do have for municipalities, we do have the municipal transfer station general permit that's much easier to use. We are looking at allowing for the option to incorporate organics into municipal leaf composting. And we can use some other tools that we have available. We can do demonstration projects and those sorts of things. So if you want to explore something within your municipality, the best thing to do is to contact the department, and we can review with you what your current permitting situation is, what space you have available, what volumes, where you'd like to do that composting. And I also added onto this slide, there was a change in the law last year. Public Act 1935 created another niche, and this is geared towards helping to develop anaerobic digesters at agricultural operations. So for some of the larger farms, whether it's a dairy farm or a chicken farm, there is now an exemption if an anaerobic digester is sited on a farm for primary farm operations, and that would be exempted from deep solid waste permitting, and there is an allowance for a small amount, 5% of the capacity to be food scraps. So it's a way to help some of the agricultural activities and take some of their farm-generated wastes and move them into a more modern technology, the anaerobic digesters. One of the things that we're always looking for is data so that we can see what's happening and help get that back out. So some of the early programs that are out there don't have rigid reporting requirements, but from our survey of those companies that are using some of the newer options, we are seeing that there is increasing numbers of tons per month and tons per year successfully being diverted. So there are lots of opportunities that we can look to explore with you. And as noted on the slide, we're also looking to create some new general permits that will help facilitate permitting down the road. And that's, so that's going to wrap up my presentation. And the slide here does include my email information. The phone number at the office is still in service. We do check the voicemail on a regular basis. And we also have a compliance assistance number that can be used. And again, that even during the telecommute scenario, we still are responding to those phone messages as they come in. So thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Robert. Before I let you go, just a clarifying question. Somebody wanted to understand what kind of permit requirements are for small scale composting operations. I'm assuming like the community composting level.
Yes, and again, if it's for small scale, if it's going to fall under 5,000 cubic yards per year, then that would be exempted under the solid waste permitting. It may be subject to some of the stormwater permitting requirements, and later on in the series, I think towards the end of the 5 series, we're going to have one of the water program experts, Joey Letterman, providing some updates on some of the water permitting requirements.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? We'll wait for the end, but please add them to the chat box. All right, James, if you're ready to go, please unmute yourself. And it looks like Robert has stopped sharing, so if you'd be willing to share your screen, that would be great. Thank you.
Your call has been forwarded to an automated voice.
Well, that's nice. We got somebody's phone call in the middle of it. Nice. James.
Are you seeing my screen?
I'm seeing you.
Oh, nope, I need to share. Hit the share. Okay.
Excellent. Now I can, and it's full size.
And it's full size. Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead. Thank you so much.
All right. Yeah. Let me know if it doesn't progress. And yeah, thanks, Sherill. Thanks so much. And Chelsea and Deep for piping me in from neighboring Massachusetts, where my compost pile in my backyard is 154 degrees, which is a little bit hotter than I would like it, but I'm not complaining. Also want to just shout out to Domenico. I don't know if you're listening, but thanks for getting me involved in this workshop. It's exciting to be connecting with folks in Connecticut around creating composting infrastructure. Let's see. So I am going to be. It's not advancing.
It's advancing now. Thanks, James.
Just advanced. Okay, yeah. Yeah, I'm going to be speaking to site identification and to some extent factors involved in design and thinking through what a potential site might look like, and talking a little bit about capacity in terms of the basic principles of how one can look at a space and piles of rotting organic matter and convert that into tons per week of diverted organics, which is sort of the go-to, or tons per year, go-to capacity type of language that we use. Yeah, and I'm going to be talking about some of the efficiency assumptions that kind of go into those capacity estimates. It's not a uniform, completely standardized methodology. It's a nuanced topic, and every site is different. So hopefully we can kind of delve into some of the factors that affect that. And yeah, so let me just jump in here. I'm going to be pulling from my book, which is Community Scale Composting Systems. It's a little over a year old, and it is, my publisher is running an extreme discount right now. If anybody is looking for a book, a comprehensive book on food scrap composting. So the publisher is Chelsea Green Publishing, but a lot of the, basically everything that I'm going to be talking about today is covered in much more depth in this book. And so we're going to start out by talking about assessment and identification. And where I always start when I'm looking at a site is sort of with what's there, just trying to understand what's there and how, say it's a farm, what factors can kind of create for an efficient integration of composting with existing operations, or a municipal yard debris composting facility, for example. What's there? So I'm looking at things like, how can we minimize the distances traveled between different elements of the operation, between the farm and the compost, between where the tractor's housed and the compost. Looking at potential to utilize existing infrastructure, whether that be, an abandoned lot somewhere, or silage bunk on a dairy, or any number of different elements, access, roadways, utilities. So kind of taking an inventory of what resources are there, in an attempt to kind of build out a working facility as cheaply as possible. Likewise, the topography, one of the biggest things we'll kind of talk a little bit to today is just how can we drain water, essentially. I mean, that's one of the biggest factors in site design and management. In sites that aren't designed to move water away and treat it, become problematic very quickly. So utilizing areas that have some slope, typically 2 to 4% is the recommendation, and can move water either to some sort of a vegetative treatment area or retention. And I'll just mention, ideally not utilizing prime agricultural lands and disturbing them in order to process organics. Obviously, neighbors are a huge factor, and good facility design and siting goes a long, long way in preventing neighbor issues in the future. So understanding things like prevailing winds, odor corridors, where, how air moves on a site, whether or not it's going to get stuck in low spots, or what sort of buffers might be in place or might be needed to create turbulence and move air. Basically, thinking about who might be impacted and how best to mitigate those impacts. Distance and buffers being the main thing. Few compost sites that are composting, putrescible organics are going to have no odor, but the main method for at least outdoor sites is to either filter odor to prevent it, then to filter it, and then to disperse any odor so that it isn't concentrated. So thinking about how that happens in a site is one really important factor in sort of getting ahead of any neighbor issues. Sort of covered that there, but there's also a neighbor factor in terms of just what people see. Planning a site so that, you know, they're not seeing trash. Trash is associated with bad smells. Good housekeeping is absolutely essential to, you know, how a site is perceived and also how an operation sees itself. And organizing a site as best as possible so that, you know, finished compost is the first thing that people see. If it is a site where the community is going to either be involved in the operations or coming to pick up compost, if at all possible, it's nice to kind of design the site so that they're not seeing a pile of material that's waiting to be processed as soon as they arrive. Obviously, maximizing distance to any surface waters, wetlands, wells, meeting any local setbacks and state regulations that, so that's a key. I mean, that's one of the first questions I would ask at any site, is reviewing those and putting the site into the sort of the context of whatever regulations there are, both water setbacks and otherwise, roads, neighbors, that sort of thing. I already spoke to the importance a little bit about you know, having a good grade, designing a site that is high and dry. Basically, you know, low points are the hardest place. They just naturally collect water. So being up is really beneficial. Any clean water that might be coming onto the site, if you have the ability to divert that away from the site to keep clean water clean, that's a best management practice. And thinking about how moisture that does come onto the site can be managed in a dispersed manner versus being concentrated. Once it's concentrated, then it really becomes a management cost and odor risk. So sites where there is the potential to spread moisture out and treat it over in a dispersed manner is going to be the least cost, probably the most effective. And so if that can utilize existing vegetation like a meadow, that's great. It's really nice to, and this happens just randomly, I'll go out to a site and it'll be a rainy day, and that's the best time to visit a compost site or a potential compost site. You really see how it performs, and you can learn a lot about what, you know, if it's gonna, how well it functions under truly wet conditions. So most compost sites, this is especially specific to food scrap composting operations, are going to have some version of these basic elements. Obviously, there's going to be storage of raw feedstocks. Those are typically the additional non-putrescible materials that can be stockpiled, your carbon, your wood chips, your leaves, that sort of thing, your manures. And then at least at a above a super micro scale, it's really beneficial to have a dedicated receiving and blending area where food scraps can come in. They can be received on a bed of carbon. Ideally, that's sort of on a fortified compost pad, concrete, gravel. Ideally, concrete works much better, it'll last a lot longer. So that's where material is going to come in. It can be covered, blended, and then moved into the primary phase of composting, which is that, the beginnings of the active hot composting phase. It's typically where heat treatment would take place. So meeting the EPA standard or whatever version of that, be it the organic standards or state standards. And then either in the same place or possibly in an actual different location, there's sort of a secondary composting phase following that heat treatment phase where things are still very active. They are breaking down and less odorous, less problematic, require a little bit less management. And then there's a point where really the material is mostly broken down. It has little odor. There's sort of this, this finishing process that happens, and eventually it might be referred to as curing or storage, and then whatever post-processing, screening, distribution. And these phases are really important when it comes to understanding a site's capacity and thinking about it, because really, well, I don't want to jump ahead too much, but this is the way that I sort of frame any site design, is thinking about these stages, how long they're likely to take, how much space they're likely to take up. So places to invest in concrete, especially mixing areas and primary composting areas, the highest use areas, the highest impact areas. We're going to want to lay out as much as possible in order to, according to the material flow, and to minimize distances. And leaving room for access is absolutely critical. That's one of the biggest factors in whether or not a site is, at capacity or potentially over capacity, is do they actually have room to work and compost efficiently? And just a last piece in thinking about leachate, thinking about any moisture that's coming out of a raw or a raw compost, and how that keeping it upslope, keeping it downslope from finished compost, making sure that that leachate's not going to cross-contaminate any heat treated or finished compost. So you can see that here, general rule, always orient windrows with the slope so that moisture can flow. You don't want large compost piles sort of acting as a berm and blocking moisture. And then you can see here that there's plenty of space. I meant to put a picture in here of how a loader might kind of come in from the sides of those windrows and turn, and sort of the more space that there is to maneuver, the more efficiently you can turn those piles from the side. When the piles are stacked really closely together, they can really only be turned from the end. And it's very equipment specific. Some, like excavators or windrow turners, will require less space in between, but still access is a key consideration when it comes to capacity and operating well. This is just an example. This was a freshly poured slab that was a receiving area, and it was poured in a low spot, and the grade just sent water there. So just a classic kind of example of what not to do. Ultimately, we were able to grade all the land, or at least most of the land, away so that it sheds water and didn't accumulate water. But the last thing you want to do is concentrate water in your working areas. So we're going to talk now about capacity and capacity kind of related topics, and specifically kind of thinking about how to understand, again, piles of rotting organics in space and time. There is a general rule in just about all of the US that that there's more potential throughput than there is available capacity, which creates a dilemma for people who are composting and want to take on material and are being offered material. It's the challenge is that too much throughput for the system overloads it, and it creates inefficiencies, and those inefficiencies can ultimately cause much bigger issues. When you think about capacity, really what we're trying to do is map what the how much space and how much time it's going to take raw organics and get stable compost on the other side. So you can think about it as a pipeline, and if you double the amount of organics, then you're either going to need more space, or you're going to need to be able to compost in less time. You might take a composting process that's taking 9 months and get it down to 6 months. That's 30% more capacity. But yeah, essentially that's, speeding up the flow in that pipe, and it's, otherwise it's backing up. So, when there's too much material, the challenges typically are sort of this overcrowding effect that leads to water not shedding. Oftentimes sites that become super overcrowded, just like the organic matter builds up on in the pad itself, and it's very hard to kind of keep the infrastructure itself functional. And when when that happens, the ability to prevent nuisances and the risk of nuisances, the risk that comes should a nuisance happen and you really have, a mountain of compost that's stinking, it's a lot harder to deal with than, a windrow that you have good access to. So that is something that I've seen, and that I work very hard with composters to try to prevent. So to understand compost capacity, kind of the baseline is to think of what a batch is. And a batch is a blend of material of like age that's managed as a unit. It has a distinct start point where incoming fresh material may be added to the batch, and a distinct stop point after which no new material will be added. This is just kind of a simple chart of what the sort of the life of a batch of compost might look like. And so early on in this, you can see there's at the bottom, it kind of maps out the primary phase versus the secondary phase, which might be, is often kind of referred to as the active composting phase. And the primary phase may take 2-6 weeks, could take longer, but typically it's going to be, you're going to have heat treatment, you're going to have breakdown of putrescent materials pretty well within that time frame, depending on the system. Secondary phase, and these are just based on experience, 4 to 10 weeks. 4 weeks being, say, in a site that has a windrow turner or an aerated static pile system, or even a vermicomposting system. You might think of it that way. Finishing is sort of the point from which the active composting is finished, but the compost needs to mature. It's not saleable yet. It might be be kind of on the edge of being usable under some circumstances, but it's generally kind of not considered a mature product yet. And so that phase can take, there are folks who make compost in 3 months. Typically, I think in the Northeast, you see it being closer to 9 to 12 months, faster again with an aerated system, or a windrow turn system, a windrow turner. And then, so curing is sort of what I use the term curing to refer to what happens after the compost is finished. It's an aging, it's sort of a value adding, and like curing cheese or wine or something along those lines. That's where higher level organisms, more fungal species take over. That's where you're getting beneficial nematodes, that sort of thing, predatory organisms, is later in the process. So, site assessment and design involves having a concept of what a batch size is specific to the composting method that you are using. And so, sometimes it's the batch may be a windrow shape, a parabolic shape. Sometimes it may be a cuboid or, a rectangular shape. And thinking about sort of that shape in how much space it takes up and how much time in terms of throughput it represents. And so what I try to do is say I'm going to a site for the first time, I'm trying to understand what their capacity is. I'm going to try to look at a batch of compost and try to understand what time frame of throughput it represents, and then look for that sort of same unit across the site. And very quickly you can see what the time frame is for material to break down, how much space it's taking up. So here's an example of sort of a windrow. Here's the math that you could use to figure out how many cubic yards or cubic feet is in this windrow, and what the footprint of that windrow is. And let's say that this windrow was 2 weeks worth of material, and the composter was receiving 10 tons a week of food scraps. So I'm going to try, I have a picture here, and I'm going to try to explain it in sort of space and time for you. So I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but this is the receiving area, and here is the primary composting pad. And each one of the, in the scenario I just spoke to, each one of these windrows is 2 weeks worth of material. Okay, so on the primary pad, we have 3 windrows. That's 6 weeks worth of retention. Now, following that 6 weeks, 2 of these windrows will be combined into the secondary phase, and it'll go up to the secondary pad. And so that's 12 weeks worth of retention, because each windrow is now 4 weeks. And likewise, and so then each secondary windrow would go over here into the curing, the finishing. You're kind of seeing the assumption that the compost is shrinking, and you're using this consolidation to be space efficient. That's what you're sort of seeing here. Also up here in the left, there's 8 weeks of feedstocks of the additional materials that's being added to that 10 tons a week. So this type of just sort of mapping, it's a little confusing here because you can't really see what the flow is, but assuming you're kind of thinking from primary to secondary to finishing and curing, you can see how it would move. You can see sort of the staging, and in total, we have over a year's worth of retention on this site. And you have 58, looks like you have 58 weeks. So that would account for, you know, the non-sales season and the need to be able to store some compost. And these windrows are not the most efficient shape. Certainly really well cured compost could be stored in taller piles and wider piles without it being a problem. So let's see here. I'm going to talk a little bit about, you know, the assumption in thinking about compost site capacity is sort of that the space is being used efficiently. So I'm going to talk about some of the sort of the general rules of thumb when it comes to the shape of the compost, management factors that might play into that, and where you can find efficiencies and compost sites. So the first principle here is that an obvious one, a taller pile fits more volume on less of a footprint than a shorter pile. Okay, so here is a 5-foot tall pile that's 11 feet wide at the base, compared to a 6-foot tall pile that is 13 feet at the base. So that's the equivalent of 18% more footprint by adding 1 foot, but you've gotten more than twice that in terms of the volume. So you can see efficiency right there in terms of space. Small piles are really inefficient in terms of space. So in order to maximize the use of available space, increase the pile height, but without exceeding the recommended limits. And we'll talk more about sort of pile height and ideal pile height here in a minute. So principle 2 is as a pile's height increases, the surface area to volume ratio decreases. So there's less surface area per volume in a taller pile. In this case, there's 14% less by adding that foot, and it goes up non-linearly as you add height in terms of the amount of surface area that you're being lost. The challenge with, you know, really large piles is that they can't breathe. That's one challenge. Compost, other than aerated static pile systems, which can be stacked fairly large and maintaining aerobic conditions, but passively aerated compost piles can't breathe once they get to a certain height. There's also larger piles lose less moisture and they lose less heat. So if they're really wet, they tend to stay wet. If they're really hot, they tend to build heat. They can often get way too hot. Likewise, if they're too dry, a really large pile is not going to be benefiting much from times of high precipitation. You're not going to get much moisture out of that. So in general, and this is specific to food scrap composting and manure composting. Purely leaf and yard waste are typically going to be slightly larger than this, but the maximum recommended height for a turned windrow pile is 7 feet at the time of formation. That will usually kind of shrink down pretty quickly to 6 feet. For ASP systems, 8 feet, depending on the blower capacity, could potentially be slightly more or slightly less. In a case where a compost site is really, or a compost is kind of chronically wet and not drying out throughout the process, reducing pile size really, really helps with that. Just to get that increased surface area, it'll lose moisture much faster. So that said, if it's really wet and you want to keep a pile dry, then larger piles actually make more sense, because you're not going to kind of infiltrate as much. So that's one of the reasons why, as the compost matures and it's drying out, you can increase that size, and it actually is beneficial because it keeps the moisture out. So principle 3 is vertical piles. Vertically stacked piles, I have an image in a second, can fit 50 to 100% more volume on the same footprint. So this is one place where someone who's a windrow composter can add capacity quickly by putting up some bay walls and being able to kind of still manage material in batches that are segregated and have a wall, but can be, yeah, you can kind of get that vertical benefit. So that's the corresponding rule here, is basically what I just said. This is a method, especially for small sites, and in the primary phase of composting, where you really do want to keep piles and batches distinct. To have those walls in there is a way to add a lot of capacity without a lot of cost. So as compost matures, it requires less oxygen to remain aerobic, and so piles can be stacked larger. So typically, finishing compost and curing compost and compost that is being stored, can be piled at least 6, 7, 8 feet tall. It's not going to be shrinking as much. It's going to stay in those larger piles. But the key is, and they can also, you don't need necessarily room to turn the piles from the sides anymore. So they can be stacked right up next to each other, like here in this, the image, where sort of, in this case, younger piles are being moved towards older piles, and they kind of get stacked tightly to mature. And sometimes people will consolidate 2 piles and build a slightly larger pile at that point to conserve space. Yeah, and so here I speak to kind of even 8 to 10 feet tall, potentially, if the compost is really mature and requires very little oxygen demand, right? Because the microbes aren't really working very much anymore. In the early phases, things can go anaerobic very, very quickly, but later on, the microbes just aren't using the oxygen up as quickly, so you can keep things relatively aerobic, or at least from becoming problematic with larger piles. So the shape of the pile really matters when it comes to shedding moisture. So triangular, kind of the peaked type piles will shed moisture, whereas flat piles will absorb moisture. Moisture, if you haven't gotten this in the compost itself, not just on the site, but in the compost itself, really matters. Keeping compost in the 50 to 60% range in terms of moisture, like being able to squeeze the compost and just get a little bit of glistening between your fingers, and definitely it will stay in a ball. Below 50% compost, really, when you squeeze it, it won't stay in a ball. But the sweet spot is really right around 60%, where you can get a little bit of glistening, at least early in the process, because if it starts out too dry, it's going to probably really dry out and kind of slow down degradation. The microbes really need that moisture to break down organic matter efficiently. So you can form, if you want to shed moisture, if it's too wet, you want to keep your piles peaked. If you want to absorb precipitation, then you're going to kind of want to create more of a flat windrow pile so that the moisture absorbs. Also, turning the pile, you know, during a light rainstorm or can really help. Let's see here. Oh, so here you go, flatten piles to absorb precipitation. Principle 6 is, so the cross section of a windrow, look at it from the side here, like these windrows, are essentially 2 right angles. So the height, the width of the base of the windrow is essentially twice the height, give or take a foot. I usually add a foot. And so if a pile is just being managed sort of statically, there's volume reduction happening, but the footprint of the pile is not really shrinking at all. It's just kind of gravity is moving it down. And one of the things that we think about when we think about capacity is, you know, compost is going from, it will usually shrink by about 20% just in blending. And then you can assume it usually at least 40%, or sorry, at least 60% reduction in the total volume that went in. So typically you're going to assume that you're only going to get 40% back in terms of the total volume. And sometimes it's even less than that. Things break down a lot. So that's happening especially early on. And in order to sort of take advantage of that, the space that's being created as it reduces in volume, you really need to kind of move the material and consolidate it. So turning, restacking, combining piles, trimming the edges of piles, all make space that can take advantage of that shrinkage. So due to increase in the biologically active mass and insulation, temperature tends to increase as the pile size increases. As I said, so larger piles are going to insulate themselves better, and they tend to get hotter. The minimum that's usually kind of thrown out there is a cubic yard of fresh material. I mentioned that my bin in my backyard here is 154 degrees. It's definitely way under a cubic yard. It's probably less than half a cubic yard, honestly, out there right now that's degrading. But it's also pretty dry mix, and, you know, things are just working pretty well out there. So, you know, so that's the general rule of thumb that we teach, is about a cubic yard is the minimum of fresh material to kind of ensure a successful process and to kind of hit that heat treatment target of 131 degrees. But overheating, you know, the overheating, I mean, the sweet spot for degradation for efficient breakdown is 120 to 140. So above 140, theoretically, you're sort of losing efficiency. Things also tend to dry out really fast, which can be problematic. And that actually exacerbates the overheating because dry material is much more insulative. So yeah, so pile size and large piles can be a big factor in overheating. And lastly, the access, planning and maintaining the access to the piles for both turning and material movement. I think I have a graphic here, as I had before, that's just kind of showing the space that allows for you to turn especially during the active phase, during the primary phase and the secondary phase, where turning is required to keep things, to hit the heat treatment targets, but also just to kind of move things along, homogenize material, keep it, incorporate air into the process. So, in summary, there's no one way to think about, a perfect site even, or a perfect process. There's all these different factors that need to be considered, and they're very site specific and method specific. The key is to sort of understand what the composting methods that you're considering or using, what their advantages are and what their limitations are, in order to kind of create as much efficiency and really to create the best product that you can, given the operation that you're working with. Yeah, that's all I have. But I know there's going to be time for questions at the end. So thank you all very much.
Wow, that was great, James. It was a ton of information. I'm sure that some people are still sort of processing, because that was a huge overview, and it was wonderful. And I think we will wait to ask questions at the end, and we will move on to Corey. And if you will stop sharing, James, and Corey, if you would share your slides.
No.
And by all means, everybody should keep adding their questions to the chat box. And I am organizing and categorizing them, of course. And just to give everybody the heads up, Robert unfortunately has to leave at 5:45. So when we get to the questions section, I'll probably pepper him first before he leaves us. And it looks like you're up, Corey.
Great. So you can see my screen?
Yes,
fine?
and I can see and hear you. Thank you.
Great. One moment. There we go. So hi, everyone. Thank you first and foremost to Connecticut NOFA for hosting this webinar series. And a huge thank you to the planning team for working together and organizing this series. We heard a lot of great information already today, and I'm of course excited to tune into the upcoming webinars. But I will also be speaking on some best practices for incorporating food scraps into existing leaf and yard composting facilities today. So as Sherill mentioned in the beginning, I'm Corey, Strategic Services Representative at the Center for EcoTechnology. And so for some background, CET is an environmental nonprofit that helps people and businesses save energy and reduce waste. And we help businesses and institutions implement programs on the ground while also contributing and implementing effective public policy focused on these efforts, that being saving energy and reducing waste. And so also thank you to the support from EPA, USDA, and Recycle CT, because CET is also able to offer free assistance to businesses and other entities in Connecticut that are interested in starting or expanding their food waste diversion programs. So about a year ago, BioCycle and CET partnered to create this document called the Community Toolkit, adding food waste to a yard trimmings composting facility. And we created this toolkit essentially in response to the inquiries that we were receiving for the past couple of years, because we noticed that as the attention towards wasted food grew, there was also the growing need for developing the EPA food recovery hierarchy and its infrastructure. Earlier, we saw the hierarchy, and this prioritizes reducing food waste and feeding hungry people when possible, and then also looks to other beneficial uses of organic material, such as feeding animals, composting, and anaerobic digestion. So this toolkit does focus on the composting avenue of that beneficial use, also called food waste diversion. Of course, we can build new processing sites from the ground up and support food rescue organizations to grow that infrastructure need. But we can also look to that existing leaf and yard composting facilities to evaluate if they're suitable for accepting food scraps as well. But we do not want to take that lightly. We want to make sure that we're thinking about it with the proper parameters. And earlier we heard from James the different recipes and considerations, and this toolkit focus is on the surrounding kind of best practices and kind of that stepping stone for evaluating your site. So there are some of the key questions and factors to deciding if the sites are ready or can be ready for the additional material. So we were excited to partner with BioCycle Connect to develop this toolkit. They are the Organics Recycling Authority, so I like to say that they do know a thing or two about compost. Many initial questions include, what are my initial considerations? Why should I go down this path? What else should I be thinking about besides recipe, which of course is critical, but there are also other supporting factors. So BioCycle and CET work together to streamline these existing resources that do exist and develop some composting ground rules, if you will, a decision-making tree, and then practice site evaluation, which I'll walk through today. And also, thank you to the USDA, whose support did make this toolkit possible. So before we dive into the pile, I'd like to discuss or start with the why for composting wasted food. Well, number one, as I mentioned, the capacity to handle this organic material is somewhat diminishing with our existing infrastructure that we have. So we need to find alternative ways to handle it. Likewise, composting food waste can help national, regional, and local diversion goals and address regulatory requirements. So for instance, EPA and USDA, they have a goal to reduce food waste by 50% by 2030. And then we also heard about the commercial organics recycling law in Connecticut. But there are also societal and economic benefits to composting food waste. So municipalities may actually be able to save money with avoided disposal costs and reduced trash generation. And many towns have actually experienced long-term savings after some modest investments in preparation for incorporating food scraps. And then also you might just be hearing that increased demand from businesses and residents that want to have an alternative outlet for their food scraps. And so this is a good way to respond to that interest and increase community engagement. So here's the decision-making tree, which incorporates a series of yes/no questions that can guide your initial page and reading of the toolkit. So for example, first and foremost, do you have your own yard trimming composting facility? Then you can go automatically to section 2, which is your yard trimmings site food waste ready? And then go to the physical site assessment, which I'll pull up in the next slide. If you did answer no each time for these questions, you can default to other options. So that includes incentivizing home composting, looking at community composting, and then also looking at some subscription services. So we put together a series of rules of thumbs for a wide range of considerations. This includes from type of composting pad to proximity of neighbors, which we also heard about, and they're all included in the sample physical site assessment, which is the left image on the screen. And then after going through these considerations, there's also the practice worksheet, also shown here on the right. And here we highlight the minimum of what is recommended for a food waste composting site, and then a better option. So one I'll pull out is having a dedicated space for food waste receiving. In the practice physical site assessment, you'll find that the minimum is having the ability to create space when needed, but of course the better option is having a designated space for those incoming food scraps. I won't spend too much time here, but we do have the best practices to compost food waste. Here there's site design considerations, composting methods, recipes, contaminant removal. And again, this toolkit is more of that launching point for you as you kind of go down this path of evaluating if your site is or can be ready. And one thing I'll note, because this is focused on existing leaf and yard composting facilities, is you may have some available carbon in way of leaves, but you also want to inquire and look into if you have enough of that material, and then is it really going to add enough structure to your pile. The food waste composting ground rules. So here are the 4 ground rules for sure. One, always have the carbon material such as wood chips, mulch, etc. available to mix with incoming food waste. Never let that incoming food waste sit on the pad, kind of immediately incorporating that carbon material. Then also incorporating the mixed feedstocks into an active composting pile to get the heat working and it all on its way to finished compost. And then at the end of the day, or even twice a day, scraping down the surface of the food waste receiving area to really manage any of the remnants or residual liquids, which hopefully there's not much. So the question of, how do I compost this food waste can also be paired with collection and hauling considerations. So are you interested in offering residential and commercial pickup? If you have an existing contract with a solid waste hauler, or does your jurisdiction offer this service, your hauling needs will differ and your kind of pathways may be slightly different. There are some creative ways that towns have started collecting or supporting the hauling of food scraps. So for instance, I live in a town where there's a private bike pickup service for food scraps. And by bike, they take the food scraps to the local transfer station, which also is open for residents to drop off their food scraps directly if they don't want to utilize the bike system. You'll want a truck designated for organics, most likely. So you really want to make sure it's also not leaking any of the liquid material. And the most popular option for curbside collection is side loading trucks. But we also do know of some municipalities that started collecting organics and recyclables in split trucks to increase their efficiencies, but that's not always feasible. So going back to the drop-off, the potential for drop-off, because curbside collection might not be available to you, drop-off collections really can be a great place to start as they offer the opportunity for engagement with your community. There can be if space allows, you can have educational workshops offered in tandem. And many successful programs have provided containers to their residents. And drop-off programs can also be a good way to roll out or phase in the organic material to your compost. Towns offering a drop-off program also usually were able to address challenges early on because it wasn't necessarily a overhaul of a system. You're kind of taking in material slowly but surely, seeing if the recipe is working, seeing if there needs to be more engagement. And then the drop-off locations don't necessarily need to be at the transfer station. We've also seen towns utilize farmers markets, partnered grocery stores, and other locations for drop-off, whichever may be most convenient for their residents. And then also if you're contracting with a private hauler or working with commercial entities, so kind of transitioning back to the potential for curbside collection, CET does have a hauler contracting guidance document that details best practices for these agreements. And then also Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection offers a resource management contract, which is a good template for the development of collection services across the board. And they have best practices for municipalities also developing these agreements, and if those considerations and components you want to include. No matter what, if you're incorporating a drop-off program or working with outside haulers or doing the hauling yourself, you'll definitely want to have a plan in place for mitigating contamination and who will they notify if this does occur. A plan of action for cleaning the containers. I can say sometimes my own food scrap bin has gotten a little messy, but that's my own doing, that I didn't drop it off soon enough. And then also designing those educational campaigns or tools which coincides with managing that contamination. And likewise, the same goes for if you're working with commercial entities. And there's a lot more information in the toolkit, but those are some of the factors that I wanted to pull out today. Then you're also looking at what types of food waste can I compost or should I compost? So the type of feedstock that you're accepting will impact the facility design, the needed infrastructure, and in some cases the permitting category. Two of the larger categories that I'll highlight are pre and post-consumer food waste. Pre-consumer applies to kitchen food prep and prepared packaged foods that don't necessarily make it to the consumer. And post-consumer is more the items that are sold or served, such as plate scrapings. And then there are also some subcategories. So one being pre-consumer vegetative. So that's primarily fruit and vegetable material, brewery waste, coffee grounds, and that can be a good stepping stone because usually it has lower possibility for contamination. However, because it's usually higher in liquid content, you might want to manage the loads with soiled paper or corrugated cardboard to manage that effectively. And then with if the front of house collection, that's under the category of post-consumer food waste and doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily exclusive to vegetative waste. It might incorporate the meats, dairies, and compostable products, which is where you might be seeing the most contamination if an education program, signage, training is not paired alongside that. As I mentioned in the slide previously, to manage contamination, really education should be at the forefront and also ongoing. So towns have implemented mailers, signs, materials on site when you're dropping off. And there's also been a lot of success around stickers that are actually put on the lids or buckets that are provided. And then we also discuss in the toolkit the possibility of commingling the food scraps with leaf and yard trimmings pickup. So some business or some cost and economic considerations include, what should the tipping fee be for the source separated loads, labor and equipment, and then some other associated costs with expanding your site. Labor is the most immediate consideration because composting food waste does require more management and oversight. And so many leaf and yard composting facilities may only be staffed or opened seasonally or staffed part-time, even for those that are open year-round. And so you'll most likely want somebody there on site when material is coming in so that you can really address, again, that contamination, cover the material quickly and efficiently. So there is some labor investment. And then, of course, there's also the consideration of if you're expanding your site, what type of investments will you need? Composting markets. So the traditional markets for compost may include landscaping, agricultural uses, and many more. But they also, some manufacturers are offering compost blends. So that could be in potting soil, on golf course greens, etc. And the blends usually are sold at a higher price point. So that could be beneficial for the sale of your finished compost. But with that, you'll also need to be thinking again about that contamination because, of course, with any component, it's always a factor because you want to make sure there's no or very limited residuals at the end that you wouldn't want in a blend. And then another market that's been growing for compost and finished compost is stormwater management, sediment, and erosion control. And we have heard from composters over the past few months or so that they've seen an increase in sales and an interest due to the growing interest in home gardening and much more. Some few final takeaways. So most importantly, the current scale of your facility is not necessarily going to be the determining factor when looking at if you can or cannot compost food waste. You'll want to refer back to that site assessment to see what your operation currently looks like, and if you have the variety of factors that we would like to incorporate. Then food waste does not degrade gracefully, and that's coined to Nora from Biocycle Connect, who we partnered to develop this toolkit. But then I'd like to add on and say, but when planned for, you can help it degrade thoughtfully. And then, of course, start slow, learn best practices to manage that incoming food waste, and then gradually increase the quantity and types of food waste. And then education and training. It's not just education in the beginning, but how can you re-engage residents or businesses, whoever you may be working with, and reminders are key to what you can and cannot accept. So we hope you find this toolkit of value as you begin to assess if your operations are ready or can be ready to start food scraps. However, CET and Biocycle Connect are available for these additional questions. We understand that the toolkit is really just a stepping stone and a foundation for your journey to incorporating food scraps. And here is a snapshot of our Wasted Food Solutions website. The toolkit can be found under the toolbox, so toolkit, toolbox. And then again, if you have any questions, I'm happy to be available, and I think we have some time for additional questions, but of course my email is here as well as my phone number that redirects to my cell phone since we're also not in the office quite yet. Thank you.
That was great, Corey. Thank you so much. So what we have now is a really good solid 30 minutes for questions and answers. And so if James and Robert, if you would unmute yourself and if you'd be willing to share your video, that would be great. We do have a lot of questions, so I'm very excited. And as I mentioned before, I'm sorry Robert Isner needs to leave us a little bit early, so I will start with Robert. Okay, so Robert, you had tried to clarify something. There were some questions that were in the chat box, and then you might have put in a little typo because somebody asked me privately. I don't get it. So I'll start with the first one. Please clarify sources of food that farms would be allowed to accept or take, meaning what does off-site waste mean?
And I assume that was stemming from the comment on the new Public Act 19-35, which is codified in 22A-208CC. And that really, the focus there is to exempt on-farm, for-farm activities, and it does allow for up to 5% of the capacity to be from off-farm sources. So it could be from an institution, it could be from a college, it could be from a municipality, it could be from residential sources. The statute does not specify or limit where that off-site source could be from. Okay,
and in terms of the Connecticut general statute that you mentioned, in terms of 208CC, they looked for it and they couldn't find it. And you mentioned it's codified. Is it not online yet? And what does the 5% refer to?
Sure. Yeah, and it is a little hard to find because it's actually in the supplement to the Connecticut general statutes because it is so new. Unless you have to wait for the next full print of the statute to come out. So there's a supplement, but if you and we do have it on our website, but we can make that available. We can provide the link to the statute. It's pretty short. And Sherill, I started talking while you were asking the second part of the question.
No, that's okay. Part of it was also, I think they wanted to read the statute because they couldn't quite understand where the 5%, what is it 5% of? Is it total volume or solid waste? And I think that was in response to your answer when you referred to the statute. Where,
it's 5% of the volume.
5% of the volume, great. And then another question for you, Robert. What is the schedule for the permit review by the department?
And schedule review for a permit would depend on the type of permit. So if it's an individual permit, that's going to have a longer schedule. Right now, we're projecting, 8 to 12 months on a new individual permit. If it's a general permit, it's going to be a much quicker turnaround. But I think if someone has a particular project, a lot comes down to site specific. So the best thing to do is to call me or some of the permitting staff, or on the department's website. On our permitting page, there is a pre-application questionnaire. It's only a couple of pages, so you could put down some general information, and that would allow us to have a virtual meeting these days, and we can talk through project specifics. That's probably the best way to handle something.
All right, we're going to go back to the 5%. Domingo has a follow-up question. So why just 5%? Where did the 5% come from?
Yeah, and it was, and that is from the Public Act itself. And again, the focus on that Public Act 1935 was to exempt agricultural activities. So it's, these are on farm, and it can be a consortium of farms. So you can have one farm as the host, and you can have other farms that have a little co-op, and they can still send their waste there. And then there can be other organic material, yard wastes and animal bedding that could be introduced, but the food waste was limited to 5%. Again, to keep the focus on agriculture. It's an agricultural exemption.
Okay, great. Somebody wants to have an understanding, and I think it's because, I know in terms of the department, we are looking at organics recovery as a priority. And somebody's asking, between at home, on site, and large central composting adoption, which product would be the largest impact if there was a 10% uptake in adoption? I think they're asking, where's the silver bullet?
It's a great question. I think it's all of the above. When you sort of look at it in Connecticut, we love our state, but we have 169 different ways of doing things. So while a large scale project may work in one community, at home composting may work in other communities. So it's I think it really varies on the situation.
Great. Robert, I'm going to let you go whenever you feel the need to. And I think in terms of that question, I'm going to pose it first to James as well as Corey. Where do you see the solution is? At home, on site, large central composting? Where do you think the largest impact would be for our beautiful state of Connecticut?
That's, I mean, you know, if we're talking 10%, I don't know where. I would guess that the largest percentage of organics recycling is probably happening at the home scale, but I don't know. Every state's different. So you know, in terms of raw impact, I guess it would, that would be a question for wherever that is. But the home scale is often the least expensive. It's certainly the most local solution. And I think that right now is a good time to sort of strike with that sort of campaign, because people are thinking more locally, they're thinking hyper locally, and people are thinking about gardening. And so it's a good time for that type of education programming.
Great. Corey, you have anything to add? Any insights?
Well, I would second both of the statements earlier, and then just add the combination of factors and composting methods is going to create the strongest marketplace as well, because it can be very discouraging if one site, you know, is unable to start taking a certain type of material. But if you're able to then, you know, partner with another compost site nearby, or maybe some home composters don't feel comfortable composting in their backyards quite yet. So having that array of strategies is really going to build the most awareness while also building out that most resilient market.
All right, so I have somebody who's asking a really sort of generic question, but it's a great question. They're saying, where do I start? Is the best place to start with a pilot program? How do we partner with local businesses and residents and farms? They ultimately want to bring this to their schools. You have any suggestions for them? James, do you want to start and Corey add in?
Sure. I mean, yeah, I'm trying to look for which question it is to understand.
It was given to me before.
Okay.
I have a lot of questions for you.
Yeah, I mean, you know, where to start? That's a really tough question. But I think, you know, the question that sort of underlines that is who, you know, it takes somebody to actually do this work. And so that initiative is not a small thing. If someone wants to be a composter themselves, then connect with other composters, take a look at the resources. But if you're a community member who wants to see something happen, then it's going to be all about connecting with other community members and seeing where that goes, because it's not always easy. There isn't always somebody just waiting there going, I've been waiting for you to ask me to compost. Or there is someone, but you have to find them. So.
And to clarify, was the question from a school that's interested in composting?
You know, I don't know. I thought first they were a municipality, but I'm not really sure, because I know if I was trying to answer it, you start with one place, but then ultimately they want to bring it to the schools. So then I was going to mention our Connecticut Greenleaf Schools program, which I know you're involved with as well, Corey, which is a great resource. But I thought you might be able to answer the question too about how they create partnerships.
Yeah, well, and first and foremost, I would also say, you know, if it's a municipality, starting small. Biocycle did a survey of the curbside or drop-off programs for food waste across the country, and a majority of such started with, you know, opt-in residential drop-off, just to start the conversation, get a smaller amount of material before expanding to that, you know, curbside collection model or the mandatory, route. And then if it's a school and looking at partnerships or a business, I think it depends on, how, again, starting small.
Mhm.
And so we've helped schools because we do have that support from EPA and previously from Recycle CT. We are able to assist schools implement these food waste diversion programs or composting programs to a certain scale, and in which case you maybe start with a one grade or one class. If you can engage the students, that's a great way to also incorporate some learning into the classroom.
And I just want to throw out there to just, because I missed the piece on schools. I mean, schools are an amazing place to start because that's where you're going to have that long-term generational change. And the, one of the first programs I ever worked on was started at a school. It was a high school, and they had connected with a farm, a local vegetable farm, and just started composting. Just that they had been doing some leaf and yard waste on the farm, but it was just sort of one generator, one farm, and it grew, and it's grown into multiple towns, many tons of food. I mean, probably thousands of tons by now over the years. So so schools are a high impact kind of place to start, actually.
Yeah, we do have a lot of schools in Connecticut that are doing active composting on site. We do have some that are actually just collecting food scraps and then it's sent elsewhere. But if people are interested in trying to focus on schools, having your schools join the Connecticut Greenleaf Schools program is a great place to start, because then you are part of that network and you get to see what other schools are doing, whether it be integrating into the curriculum and in the classroom and or outside. Though it's a little different right now because it's unclear where schools are at and where the food is being generated, so the food scraps are being generated. So I think I'm going to move on into another sort of how to help question. I see that somebody asked a follow-up to Coryanne about what are you saying is the best management for where municipalities should start? And on that same thing, are there generally resources or guidelines available for nonprofit farms or municipalities who would like to start a public composting facility? And Corey, I'll have you start, and then James and Robert, if you have something you would like to add, by all means.
Yeah, so to start, yes, I would say municipalities that have a centralized location for drop-off of organics from their residents, that being, are you able to manage those food scraps with your, leaf and yard composting facilities, or are you partnering with, private facilities and haulers that might be able to collect that material? So that drop-off, can be, we've seen it at farmers markets, we've seen it at transfer stations, really wherever you think would be most utilized. And then with resources for entities wanting a starting point, I would say the toolkit streamlines those resources that kind of consolidates them so that you can find a lot of helpful resources to kind of start your journey in the toolkit.
Great. James, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I mean, I'm shamelessly going to say that my book is pretty comprehensive in a resource in terms of kind of exactly that, farms looking to plan a food scrap composting facility. Yeah.
All right. Robert, chime in if you have anything you'd like to add.
Well, I think we just heard from two experts, and I would just add that, in Connecticut, it's because of the dynamics that we have and diversity from community to community. It really depends on whether there is space available at the transfer station to be able to collect and transfer out, or operate, the ability to compost on site. So it's a municipality by municipality decision.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to get into some technical questions, and specifically about the composting process. Somebody is wondering about the amount of sunlight the compost pile needs. And they say that theirs is getting some, but it's sort of basically in the woods. How much sunlight does a compost pile need?
It's not a factor. I usually, the process works with and without sunlight. Yeah.
Okay. And then I have a very long question. So I'm going to have everybody take a deep breath as I read the entire thing. My question is this: I pick up kitchen waste from 2 markets once per week. I've been adding them to the working pile and occasionally adding leaves and a smaller amount of wood chips and turning it with my bucket loader weekly. At the end of the season, meaning November, I start a new pile and leave the working pile alone until spring, when I turn it several times more, screen it, and use it. I make about 60 cubic yards per year. I'm wondering if the working pile is not maturing sufficiently due to the constant addition of new nitrogenous material without an adequate waiting period between turnings. The temperature gets up to 120 degrees and drops down to 100 during the week, depending upon the moisture. I turn the pile every time I add new green material because I have black bears that will maraud my pile if I don't, and my neighbors get nervous if I attract them. I also cannot use manure because my partner is vegan and we eat most of our meals from our 2-acre garden. I have the entire season to make compost. What is the best way for me to produce finished compost with these parameters? Do I need to change my methods?
So I guess I would kind of speak generally to that the yes, in an ideal world, you stop adding new material to old material at an interval that is, depending on how much you have available. Maybe it's making a new batch every month or every 2 months or even every 3 months. And that would be, that would be kind of a fairly long batch. Just to let the process finish. And yeah, I mean, ultimately, if I don't know that I wrap my head completely around that scenario, but it's composting that's being turned fairly frequently, but that's sort of being built out over a long period is, it probably is going to take at least 6 months, if not 9 months, to become really fully mature from sort of the point at which they last added new material. Yeah, I think.
Great, thank you. And this question is sort of diverting in a new direction. So if nobody can answer it, what I encourage the planning committee, who I know that a bunch of us are on the call, is to think about it for the future, as the compost group probably wants to continue these in the future. So I'm curious about vermicomposting. Do vermicomposting systems exist on a commercial scale? I can answer that, yes. Not in the household or classroom. If so, larger systems, where do they exist? What kind of processing capacity do they have? I guess my assumption is using worms might limit throughput efficiency, making vermicomposting better suited for small scale applications. Do you know anything about worms, James or Corey?
Sure. Yeah, sure. I mean, they do exist commercially, although vendors tend to come and go. There just isn't a huge market for commercial scale vermicomposting systems in the US. So vendors tend to come and go. There are, just to kind of throw out a metric, a continuous flow vermicomposting bed that's 2 feet deep. So that's a bed that is fed from the top, and 2 months later, finished vermicompost is cut off of the bottom. A bed that is 40 feet long and 4 feet wide only processes about a cubic yard of compost a week. So it's taking up a lot of space for a very small volume of material. So in terms of, processing capacity, it's, it takes a lot of space. It slows down a lot if you don't have an indoor environment. There's definitely limitations. That said, people are getting, 10 to 30 times as much for vermicompost as they do for regular compost. So there's definitely a market there.
It's my understanding that worms can eat half their weight every day. So would it be a good waste diversion program or a way to recover food scraps, not necessarily focusing on the end product?
I mean, I think they're as Robert pointed out, they're an engaging method. So yeah, I mean, I think that they're perfect for places where, you're not going for capacity, you're going for engagement, you're going, you're trying to do something that is going to create a super valuable product. I mean, the worm compost is just awesome and has value that regular compost doesn't.
Right.
I would also just point out, I don't have it right here to grab. Actually, I do have it right off the shelf here.
Yeah, I was gonna say you probably can't hear James now, but I know worm castings are the small.
This is the Worm Farmer's Handbook.
Yeah.
That's a new book that just came out that's really great.
And worm castings are one of the best type of soil amendment because the smaller the poop, the better it is. All right, I guess we'll move on. I love worms, so I love the question, whoever asked it. So now, because we're getting close to end of time, I will try to get to the other questions, but I want to make sure I ask the question. Somebody asked a really big question of, can you provide us with a basic budget? Example, land acquisition and use, cost to site, to construct, manage, permit, staff, and revenue from sales of compost. So I think somebody's asking, what is the sort of soup to nuts estimated cost of doing such an activity? And that's for everybody. Anybody excited
I can't.
To tackle that?
Yeah, it's not. Those aren't numbers that I can that I tend to just throw out there because it's.
It depends.
It depends, and you talk about it's all depends on what's involved, but definitely feel free to reach out to. And I also just want to throw out there that Corey and CET and myself do a lot of work together, and kind of have really complementary roles, and so that's definitely an option.
Well, you've warmed it up for the next question, which is somebody's asking whether or not either or both of you do consulting work for either farms or municipalities to assist them from starting up or the whole kit and caboodle. So this is your opportunity to plug yourself.
Composttechnicalservices.com. Find me there. Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and CET, it's a pleasure working with James and his expertise. From CET's perspective, if municipalities are also looking at how they can be engaging their businesses, their institutions, that's kind of our primary focus, is helping implement those programs. But if you're looking more at the recipe development, I would defer to James. But we do work in close partnership, so you'll probably stumble upon either of us if you reach out to either of us.
All right. Somebody, Kip, who is like the soil guy, I think this was in reference to when you were doing your presentation, James, said that he would recommend an on-site investigation by a soil scientist to identify depth of seasonal high water table and the kind of water table, that soil survey maps are only a guide. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but I just wanted to bring that out. And of course, I will just add that, tonight is just the beginning of 5 webinars. We would have normally been in person. It would have been a long day. You would have been exhausted. And with Zoom meetings, we tend to get exhausted after 2 hours. And so we're going to have to take it in bits and pieces. And we do have speakers. The next webinar, which is on September 9th, we will be hearing about case studies of municipalities that are doing different things. Everything from adding food scraps to their current leaf compost pile, to thinking about setting up a commercial regional facility, to other ways of collecting food scraps. And then you'll find on September 23rd, Jim Hyde from USDA is going to be talking about nutrient management and environmental planning. And that's probably going to bring in a lot of topics related to some of the details of how to get the information that James was pointing out. So we're going to continue on with the series, and hopefully you'll learn a lot more as we go along. In terms of any additional questions I may have, I think there's a question about home composting, if anybody wants to tackle it. Does anybody have a preferred home composting system, container, or vendor that they like or they would recommend? I know it's a small question after the big questions, but I don't know if anybody has any thoughts.
Jora, Jora, is one of the best. There's a very similar product called Good Ideas. They're large insulated tumblers. They're not inexpensive at all, but I assume that they're sort of a lifetime investment, and they're contained. They heat up with the insulation, and they allow you to turn really easily because they're tumblers.
Great. I know I would recommend any town that's looking at doing a compost bin distribution is, if you're in an urban setting, small is fine, but if you really want a good composting system, you do want a larger bin. Corey, did you have something to add?
Well, this is not from a CET perspective, but personally, I have success with the Earth machine. So
Nice.
it's a good home.
I have a pallet system outside, but I must admit, I do have worms in my basement. So now it's public information. Yeah, my basement. I think that is all the pressing questions that I have received. I think there's a lot of conversation about worms in the chat box, but we'll leave that to the group. So I'm just going to ask everybody to sort of conclude any thoughts or advice or suggestions you have for any of the participants that are still with us. And we'll start with you, Robert, and then we'll go to Corey, and then we'll end with James.
Just thanks again, Sherill, for your organization, and thanks, Corey and James, for your time. Be well, everyone.
Thank you. Corey, do you have any thoughts or suggestions?
Thank you to all the panelists. And again, kind of to reiterate, I think components of what we all said: start small, reach out to the entities that are working in Connecticut or surrounding areas. And there's plenty of resources and plenty of people that want to help.
And James, you have anything you'd like
sure.
to add?
Yeah, well, no, thank you. And thank you all. And the questions were great, and it was a lot of fun to kind of hear what people are thinking. And yeah, I mean, just that if there is a silver lining to these strange times, it is, people are out there looking for compost right now. And so, yeah, that's
Great.
Something to, yeah.
So I'm just going to remind
stay safe,
everybody.
everyone.
Oh, I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, just stay safe. Just stay safe.
So I'm just going to remind everybody the recording, this is recorded, as well as the other webinars will be recorded and then be put on the department webpage, Connecticut NOFA, as well as the Connecticut Resource Conservation and Development. Those were added to the chat box. Looks like Robert Isner has also added the link to the statute, to the Connecticut General Statute as well. And I just want to let everybody know you will be receiving an evaluation by email from the Connecticut Resource Conservation and Development. I encourage you to take time to respond so that we can improve these programs as we move forward, because we really do want to increase compost literacy in Connecticut. Thank you for joining us tonight. Stay safe.